Welcome dear students. Today we are going to discuss Hobbes' social contracts. Let's firstly have a look on the objectives of this lecture. So the first objective of this lecture would be to understand why people in state of nature wanted to end it up. Then to analyze how Hobbes has come up with his concept of contract. And then we will try to understand why Hobbes has assigned absolute power to his sovereign. Then to understand the nature of his contract, and finally there will be the conclusion of this topic. Now dear students, let's have the look on the introduction. All the individuals in the state of nature make a promise to each other that henceforth they will each give up their natural rights in favor of the sovereign and will obey his laws. They promise each other that in choosing their sovereign, they are to be understood to be authorizing all his future actions. The contract is of the form, and I quote, "I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition that you give up your right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner." This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth, in Latin civitas. Here is another version of how the state is created through the Hobbesian social contract. A commonwealth is said to be instituted when a multitude of men do agree and covenant, every one with every one, that to whatsoever man or assembly of men shall be given by the major part the right to present the person of them all, that is to say, to be their representative. Every one, as well as he that voted for it, as he that voted against it, shall authorize all the actions and judgments of that man or assembly of men in the same manner, as if they were his own, to the end to live peaceably amongst themselves and be protected against other men. The social contract creates a sovereign and at the same time another new entity called the state. The fact that it is by choosing a sovereign, the people also create the state. It should not make us miss the separateness of the state from the sovereign. The state is an artificial person and therefore needs a natural person to bear with its persona. Without this persona, it cannot act. We choose an individual or a body of men to bear this persona and authorize his or their actions. When he or they act, it is the state that is acting. It is state that is the repository of power, with the sovereign as its representative and the subjects owe allegiance to the sovereign as the representative of the state. Earlier, the monarch did not just represent the state, he or she was the state. Hobbes posits the state as something independent of the king, who is just someone who acts for the state. Just as Hobbes displeased the king's lobby by insisting that even an absolute monarch is chosen by the people and not appointed by God. Similarly, by explaining that the sovereign assumes the persona of the state, or that the sovereign plays the role of the state, Hobbes introduced a distinction between the sovereign and the state, with far-reaching consequences. As Sickner has argued that this distinction between the monarch and the state was made earlier as well by the Republican and constitutionalist tradition. What Hobbes did was not just to separate the king from the state, but also to distinguish between the people and the state. For Hobbes, whether the state was represented by a democratic government or a monarchical one, the seat of sovereignty was the state, not the king or the people. For Sickner, it is with Hobbes that a new discourse of state enters political thought. Now, dear students, let's have a look on the sovereignty of Hobbes. Now, for Hobbes, the people can choose to vest sovereignty in one person or in an assembly of persons. What is more important is that the sovereign, whoever it may be, is absolute. In Leviathan, both in the chapter on the rights of the sovereign as well as in the chapter on the dissolution of commonwealth, one can easily see the absolute nature of Hobbes' sovereign. Consider the long list of the rights of the sovereign in chapter 18. The people cannot, without the sovereign's permission, make a new contract to change the form of government. They cannot ever accuse the sovereign of any act of injustice or punish him or them for such acts. The sovereign has the right to be the sole judge of which policy is the best for the peace and defense of the people. The sovereign has the right of censorship, and so on. In chapter 29, Hobbes reinforces his point about absolute sovereignty by stating, right at the beginning of the chapter, that it is the want of absolute power that leads to the dissolution of a commonwealth. If the people are allowed to judge for themselves what is good and evil, if their property is considered to be out of bounds of the sovereign's fiat, and if the sovereign is considered to be subject to his or their own laws, then one can be sure that the state will not be able to maintain itself. Any questioning of the absolute power of the sovereign is a step towards the dissolution of the commonwealth and a return to the state of nature, which, as we saw earlier, is akin to a terrible state of war. We must remember that what Hobbes is doing here is highlighting the absolute power of the state. Suppose the form of government that the people choose is a democracy, with the sovereign being an assembly of men. The same rights of sovereignty will inhere in this assembly of men, who will exercise these rights in the name of the state. It is the state which is now, for example, the overlord of the people's property. The right to life, in fact, is the only right that Hobbes allows individuals to retain from the state of nature. As they make their transition into becoming members of a commonwealth, Hobbes clearly states that this retention does not mean that the state or sovereign has a duty to respect his subjects' right to life. Since the sovereign is not a party to the contract, he has no obligations towards the subjects. The sovereign retains his natural rights to do as he will. However, if the sovereign wills the death of any one subject, that subject has the right to defend his life. It's only the subject as an individual who retains this right to self-defense. The power of the absolute sovereign can crush all individual desire. The point of arguing that we have authorized this individual or this body of men to bear the person of the state was to signal that this act of authorization by the subjects was also one of marking boundaries. Those bearing the person of the state had to stay within the bounds of their authorization. But Hobbes turned the idea of authorization upside down. For Hobbes, the concept of the political covenant is not a means of limiting the powers of the crown. Properly understood, it shows that the powers of the crown have no limit at all. Not only do the members of the multitude have no remaining right to question the actions of their sovereign, they have a positive duty to own whatever actions their sovereign may undertake in seeking their safety and contentment. But this is to say, according to Hobbes' theory of attributed action, that the public acts of the sovereign and hence of the state are nothing other than the acts of the individual members of the multitude. So it will not merely be unjust for them to oppose their sovereign, it will actually be self-contradictory, for they will be opposing themselves. In his defense, Hobbes states that his commonwealth is an absolute but minimal state. There might not be any unjust laws, since justice is defined by law, and law is the command of the sovereign. But Hobbes does distinguish between good and bad laws. In answering his own question, what is a good law? Hobbes writes that the use of laws is not to bind the people from all voluntary actions, but to direct and keep them in such a motion as not to hurt themselves by their own impetuous desires, rashness, or indiscretion. And therefore, a law that is not needful, having not the true end of a law, is not good. Unnecessary laws are not good laws, but traps for money. The purpose of a law is to maintain order, to prevent individuals from physically harming each other. Good laws are those which do not interfere too much with the life of the citizens. For instance, in their economic dealings with one another, in how they educate their children, the institution of the family, etc. The distinction between the private and the public is crucial here. The private realm, which is the space of individual desire, is left alone. A good monarch is one who, by not interfering in this private space, allows his subjects the maximum amount of liberty to pursue their desires. In the state of nature, individuals had the freedom to do anything at all, for there were no laws forbidding them from performing any action. The laws of nature existed, but in the absence of enforcement. As Hobbes said, a law is not really a law. What constrains an individual's liberty in the state of nature was not law, but rather other individuals, who often, by use of brute force, prevented each other from obtaining that which they desired. When these individuals sign the social contract and establish a commonwealth, they have to live under the enforceable laws of the monarch. They no longer have the liberty to do anything at all, But since the state prevents other persons from physically constraining them, and as a minimal state frames as few laws as possible, these individuals are able to enjoy more liberty in the commonwealth. This is how Hobbes understands the relationship between individual liberty and the state. For Hobbes, the public good merely means individuals being able to satisfy their own desires. There is no longer any harmony assumed between one person's felicity and another person's. In his effort to make himself happy, an individual will probably make another person unhappy. This assumption is, in fact, one of conflict, and it becomes the function of the state to prevent individuals from interfering in each other's happiness or liberty. The state is to maintain the liberty of each person to do as he pleases without infringing on another's liberty. Now, dear students, let's have a look on the nature of contract that Hobbes has discussed. So, each individual, by consenting to a set of rules, guaranteed basic equality with every other member. This also meant that no one possessed more rights than another. The sovereign must treat all the individuals equally in matters of justice and levying taxes. Hobbes defined justice as equality in treatment and equality in rights. Also invoked keeping one's promises, for non-performance would lead to an unequal status. Hobbes equated justice with fairness, treating others as one would expect to be treated. Once the sovereign power was created, it would be bestowed with all powers. And I quote, "This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense." End quote. The contract created civil society and political authority, for it was a social and political contract. It was a contract of each with the other. A commonwealth could be established by two methods: one, acquisition, and second, institution. Now, acquisition was when individuals were threatened into submission. The process of institution was when individuals of their own impulse united, agreeing to transfer all their natural powers through a contract to a third party of one, few, or many. Both were contractual, though the process of institution exemplified the essence of contractualism. The contract was perpetual and irrevocable. Individuals limited their sovereignty voluntarily by creating a civil society. Hobbes preferred the beneficiary of the contract, the third person, that to be a monarch. Commonwealths differed not due to the nature of the sovereign power, but in the numbers who yielded and exercised this power. Monarchy was preferable to an aristocracy or democracy because of the following reasons. A. The self-indulgence of one compared to that of many would be cheaper. B. The existence of an identity of interests between the king and his subjects. And C. Less intrigues and plots which were normally due to personal ambitions and envy of members of the ruling elite. Adhering to the monistic view, Hobbes saw the sovereign power as undivided, unlimited, inalienable, and permanent. The contract created the state and the government simultaneously. His defense of absolute state power in reality was a justification of absolute government or monarchy because of a failure to distinguish between the state and the government. However, absolute power was not based on the notion of the divine rights of the king, but derived through a contract that was mutually agreed upon and willingly acquiesced to. He dismissed the divine rights argument, but was unwillingly to press the contractarian argument to its logical conclusion. For he did not provide for either a renewal of consent or a periodic assessment of the sovereign by the people. The sovereign power or the dominium, a term used in De Cive, was authorized to enact laws as deemed fit, and such laws were legitimate. Hobbes was categorical that the powers and the authority of the sovereign had to be defined with least ambiguity. The Leviathan was the sole source and interpreter of laws. He was the interpreter of divine and natural laws. Unlike Baudin, Hobbes did not circumscribe the power of the sovereign by placing it under divine and natural laws. In fact, the Leviathan was not even subject to civil laws. Being the sole source of these laws, the sovereign was bound by these laws as long as they were not repealed. Hobbes defined the law as a command of sovereign, a viewpoint adapted by Bentham and John Austin in their description of sovereignty. Since a law was the command of the sovereign, it could be wrong, unjust, or immoral. The sovereign not only administered the law but also enforced it. Voltaire, like Hobbes, favored an absolute, undivided sovereign power, which, however, would not be despotic. The sovereign enjoyed absolute powers only because the individuals had totally surrendered their powers. Hobbes conceptualized an absolute sovereign power only because of his thoroughgoing individualism. The absolute sovereign represents the individuals and was constituted by them for providing order and security and averting the worst of all evils, civil war. Hobbes did not recognize any pre-political order of society based on kinship, religion, and other associations, which normally contributed to sociability in the individual. He was quite unsympathetic towards customs, traditions, and other moralities that existed outside the purview of the sovereign law. On this basis, he proclaimed that law was not derived from the social institutions of a people, but was the command of the sovereign. This was because he ruled out private beliefs, which he considered to be the source of all seditions and dissensions. Authority was either unitary or nothing. He also made the sovereign above the law, thereby giving the death blow to one of the most cherished legal doctrines of the medieval period. The sovereign had the right and the duty to govern and conduct policy, protect civil society from dissolution, limit or restrict freedom of expression, opinions, and doctrines, control subjects' property, resolve all conflicts through the right of judicature of hearing and deciding all controversies, make war and peace with other nations, choose ministers, councillors, magistrates, officers, both in peace and war, confer honors and privileges, determine artificial religion and the forms of its worship, and prevent access to subversive literature. The subjects had no appeal against the will of the sovereign. Hobbes was against the division of sovereign authority as advocated by the parliamentarians in the England of his time. The subjects would never have the right to change the form of their government because they were bound to obey a particular sovereign and acknowledge his public acts as their own. As the individuals entered into a contract with one another and not with the sovereign power, they could never be freed from the subjection of the sovereign. The sovereign's subjects had a duty and an obligation to obey the sovereign, since the sovereign was the result of their social contract. Hobbes was the first to comprehend the nature of public power as a permanent, sovereign, rightful, and authorized representative to exercise powers giving life and motion to society and the body politic. Sovereignty characterized the position rather than the person who wielded it. The sovereign will unite it all in one voice, one will, and in the process ensured unity. The state in Hobbes' theory became the dominant institution in political and social life. The state changed the miserable, poor, and nasty lives that individuals led prior to its establishment and enabled them to pursue their interests. It was the ruthlessness of individuals that made the invisible power of the state an absolute necessity. The sovereign created enough order to ensure that competition between discrete individuals became peaceful and orderly. The use of laws is not to bind the people from all voluntary actions, but to direct and keep them in such a motion as not to hurt themselves by their own impetuous desires, rashness, or indiscretion, as hedges are set not to stop travelers, but to keep them in the way. Now, dear students, let's conclude today's lecture. The cause for disorder, according to Hobbes, was general desirelessness among individuals who were equal. The problem got compounded in a situation of scarcity. Social peace was only possible when individuals abandoned or restricted their passions and appetites, or if the available pool of resources was increased. Since the second option was not feasible, he preferred the first. There was no possibility of a metamorphosis of human nature. Instead, the political order was devised to accept human egoism and self-interest. The state was no longer visualized as a moral institution that would transform individuals. It was to restrain individuals through the overwhelming power of the sovereign, without preventing the pursuit of their desires. Since the state existed for individuals to fulfill their aspirations and ensure their well-being, Hobbes was therefore an individualist and a utilitarian. The sovereign's position is similar to a referee in a football match as the grand master of the rules. The political system for Hobbes meant a system of rules which was only possible if there was a civil peace. A system of rules could become operative only if justice was understood as fairness, equality of rights, and equality of treatment. To the question, how would egoists be expected to act fairly towards one another, and Hobbes' answer to individuals was follow the cardinal principle of do not that to others you would not have done to yourself. Fairness did not demand that individuals forsake their egoism, but that they imaginatively substitute others for oneself. Hobbes' equation of justice with fairness and equality has become part of political lexicon of subsequent liberalism. Furthermore, Hobbes also made it clear that it was only with the creation of a common political language that political order was possible. Hobbes' sovereign stood outside the society, and it was only fear and interest that supplied the reason for his existence. However, his analysis of power was over-simplistic, for power required not only the elimination of hindrances, but also getting the citizens to participate actively. Hobbes separated community and public will, and it was Rousseau who subsequently revived the older notion of a community as a corporate fellowship, and then endowed it with the unity of will associated with the Hobbesian sovereign. The authorizer sovereign had his limits, bound by the laws of nature, to pursue peace and safety. The sovereign had duties towards the subject. The sovereign would protect his subject from rebellion, and for this Hobbes laid down 7 injunctions. The first was patriotic commitment to the status quo. The second, to resist demagogues. The third was to respect the established government. Fourth, there was a specific need for civic education. Fifth was the importance of discipline that was inculcated in the home. Sixth, there was a need for people to be taught about law and order, to abstain from violence, private revenge, dishonor to person, and violations of property. And finally, that right attitudes would bring about the right behavior. Hobbes had faith in the universities to train and educate the citizen elite with the help of his Leviathan. So dear students, this was all about today's topic. Hope you have enjoyed it.